A man is drowning. He thrashes. He kicks. He claws at the water with everything he has left. And the harder he fights, the faster he sinks. Now picture the opposite. A man floats on his back, arms loose, lungs full of air, doing almost nothing at all. He survives the very ocean that killed the fighter. This is not a story about swimming. It is the exact shape of a question that haunted one of history's most brilliant and most disturbed minds for 60 years. In 1913, in a quiet study in Zurich, a highly respected doctor sat alone and watched something impossible. He saw, in broad daylight, a wave of blood rising over Europe. Bodies, rubble, cities swallowed. He did not know if he was losing his mind. 18 months later, the trenches of the First World War would make his vision look almost gentle by comparison. His name was Carl Jung, and what he discovered in the wreckage of his own sanity would eventually explain why ambitious people fall apart, why desperate love repels the very thing it wants, why armies that conquered continents could not conquer their own officers' nightmares, and why, for you, right now, trying harder might be the exact reason you keep losing. Somewhere in Vienna, a former mentor was about to become his greatest enemy. Somewhere in his own household, a father's quiet loss of faith was already rewriting a boy's mind before he could speak in full sentences. And somewhere buried under decades of psychiatric journals and locked drawers, a single black notebook would sit unpublished for almost 100 years, because what was written inside it was too dangerous, too strange, too intimate to show the world. We are going to open that notebook, but first, we have to go back to a small parsonage in Switzerland, where a boy is sitting in a pew, listening to his father preach about a God the father no longer seems to believe in, because that is where the drowning begins. Keswil, Switzerland, late 1800s. A pastor stands in a pulpit made of dark oak, his voice steady, resonant, certain. He speaks of divine order, of a universe governed by a loving hand. At home, behind a closed study door, that same man sits for hours in silence, wrestling privately with doubts he will never bring into the light. His son watches both versions of him. The boy is Carl Gustav Jung, and he is learning something most children never articulate, that words and truth are not always the same thing, that a man can say, "I believe," with total confidence, while his eyes say something else entirely. It is a small observation. It will detonate an entire field of science. Jung begins watching everyone this way. The relatives who smile too widely at funerals. The elders whose sermons on humility arrive wrapped in pride. He starts collecting a private inventory of human contradiction, long before he has a name for what he's doing. Decades later, sitting across from patients in a Zurich asylum, he will recognize the same split, magnified, weaponized, and turning people inside out. A wealthy industrialist arrives at his practice, successful, married, admired, and utterly hollow, plagued by an anxiety he cannot name and cannot escape, no matter how many companies he acquires. A devoutly religious woman arrives, tormented by violent, blasphemous thoughts she is horrified to even admit, thoughts that seem to arrive from nowhere, uninvited, relentless. Jung begins to suspect something radical. These people are not broken. They are at war, each one split between the self they present and a second self they have spent a lifetime refusing to meet. And the harder they suppress that second self, the louder it becomes. He will later give this exiled figure a name that will outlive him by a century. The shadow. Not evil, not weakness. Simply everything a person has decided is unacceptable about themselves. Banished, buried, denied a seat at the table. But banished things do not disappear, they wait. And in 1907, a letter arrives at Jung's home from a man in Vienna who has been thinking about hidden truths of his own. A man whose theories are about to make Jung famous, and whose friendship is about to nearly destroy him. His name is Sigmund Freud. Their first conversation lasted 13 hours. Two brilliant, obsessive minds, trading ideas without pause, without food, without noticing the sun go down and come back up. Freud, the elder statesman of a controversial new science. Jung, the prodigy he had been searching for, someone to inherit the throne of psychoanalysis and drag it into legitimacy. Freud once wrote to Jung and called him his adopted eldest son, his successor, his crown prince. For a man whose actual father had quietly lost his faith behind closed doors, this meant more than Freud could have known. For 6 years, it worked. They exchanged hundreds of letters. They toured America together. They built an entire discipline from nothing. Then it cracked. Freud believed the unconscious mind was, at its core, driven by repressed sexual desire, a single engine underneath almost all human behavior. Jung agreed. The unconscious was real, was vast, was more powerful than the conscious mind wanted to admit. But he believed Freud had found only one room in a house with 1,000 rooms. The disagreement should have been an academic footnote. Instead, it became a rupture neither man ever recovered from. Letters turned cold. Warmth turned to suspicion. In 1913, the correspondence stopped entirely. Jung had lost a friend, a mentor, and the identity he had spent 6 years building around another man's approval. What happened next has never fully made sense to historians, until you understand what Jung believed was happening beneath the surface of his own mind. He began to unravel, not the way people usually imagine unraveling. He kept practicing medicine. He kept his marriage, his patience, his reputation intact on the outside. But privately, alone in his study at night, he began experiencing waking visions, so vivid, he questioned his own sanity. Visions of rivers of blood, of Europe drowning, of a catastrophe with no name yet. He wrote later that he seriously considered whether he was going mad. Then World War I began, and the horror in his mind and the horror in the newspapers became almost impossible to tell apart. Most doctors, faced with what Jung was experiencing, would have prescribed rest, distance, suppression, starve the visions until they stopped. Jung did something almost nobody in his position would have dared. He walked toward them. Every night, for years, Jung sat alone with a blank notebook and deliberately summoned the very visions that terrified him. He gave the figures in his mind names. He argued with them. He drew them in elaborate, haunting color, mandalas, serpents, ancient robed men, cities of glass and fire that existed nowhere but inside his own skull. He called this process active imagination. His family, watching from the next room, might have called it something closer to a breakdown. The result became a private manuscript, so strange, so personal, that Jung never allowed it to be published in his lifetime. Bound in red leather, filled with obsessive, dreamlike illustrations, it was locked away by his family for decades after his death. Scholars who glimpsed fragments of it whispered about it for a century before the public ever saw a page. It became known as the Red Book. Historians and psychologists still argue about what exactly happened to Jung during those years. Some call it a psychotic episode. Jung himself, near the end of his life, called it the most important thing he ever did. The raw material every one of his later theories would be built from. Inside those pages, one insight kept resurfacing, dressed in different symbols each time. The thing he was most afraid of was never actually trying to destroy him. It was trying to be integrated. Every monster in his visions, once approached instead of run from, transformed into something usable, a source of energy, insight, even creative power. The demon that terrified him from a distance became, on closer inspection, an exiled piece of himself. Jung began to suspect this wasn't only true for him. He started to see the same pattern in his patients, in world events, in the deepening catastrophe of the war outside his window. Nations were not being destroyed by their enemies alone. They were being destroyed by the parts of themselves they refused to face, projected outward onto an enemy so they would never have to look inward. He wrote a sentence during this period that would come to define his entire life's work. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. It sounds almost gentle. Read quickly. It is not gentle at all. Imagine kneeling at the edge of a still lake, desperate to smooth its surface flat with your bare hands. Every motion you make sends new ripples outward. The harder and faster you push, the more violently the water resists. Panic sets in. You push harder still. The lake only grows more disturbed. Eventually, exhausted, you stop, and within a minute, without a single further effort from you, the water settles into perfect stillness on its own. Jung watched this exact pattern in human beings for the rest of his career, over and over, in almost every form suffering can take. A man terrified of abandonment grips his partner so tightly that he strangles the very relationship he is trying to save. A woman, desperate for approval, performs so relentlessly for others that she disappears entirely, until no one, including her, can locate who she actually is underneath the performance. An executive so consumed with proving his worth through conquest builds an empire that makes him rich, feared, and almost completely alone. In every case, Jung noticed the same mechanism at work. The conscious mind identifies a fear, abandonment, worthlessness, failure, and then throws everything it has at eliminating that fear through force. Control, achievement, vigilance, perfectionism, and in every case, the force itself feeds the fear it was meant to destroy, because force is, at its root, a confession. You do not fight furiously against something you do not, on some level, believe could defeat you. This was not a new idea invented by a Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century. Centuries earlier, in ancient China, philosophers had already given this pattern a name: Wu Wei, action born from alignment rather than force. Water that carves stone not by attacking it, but by yielding to it patiently. For 1,000 years, Jung had arrived, from an entirely different direction, at the same ancient door. But knowing a truth intellectually and living it are very different things, and Jung was about to be tested by something not even his own visions had fully prepared him for. Jung gave a name to the mask, too. He called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient Roman theater. The face we present to the world, the competent professional, the devoted parent, the easygoing friend who never seems to need anything from anyone. The persona is not inherently dishonest. Every functioning society requires one. The danger, Jung warned, begins the moment a person forgets it is a mask at all, the moment the actor believes he has become the character permanently, and locks the real face away behind it, sometimes for an entire lifetime. He saw the cost of this everywhere in his consulting room. Marriages between two exhausted performers, each one privately terrified the other might someday glimpse what's underneath the mask and leave. Careers built entirely around outrunning a private sense of inadequacy. Neither partner had spoken aloud in decades. Entire families organized, silently, around the unspoken rule: we do not discuss what actually hurts. He watched patients spend extraordinary energy maintaining an image of having it all together, and identified this, correctly, as one of the most exhausting and least sustainable projects a human mind can undertake. Because underneath every mask, the exiled shadow does not politely wait its turn. It leaks. It appears in the sudden rage that seems wildly disproportionate to its trigger, in the affair that made no rational sense to the person having it, in the successful man who sabotages himself right at the threshold of the achievement he claims to want most. Jung proposed something that, in a culture obsessed with self-improvement through addition, more skills, more discipline, more optimization, sounded almost like heresy. Real transformation, he argued, rarely comes from adding something new on top of who you already are. It comes from subtraction, from taking the mask off long enough to meet whoever has been standing behind it the entire time, sometimes for 30 or 40 years, waiting to be acknowledged. He called this lifelong process individuation, becoming at last who you actually are, rather than who you were trained to perform. Almost no one, he warned, completes it early. Most people spend the first half of life building the mask. The real war begins in the second half, when the mask stops working and nothing else has been built to replace it. There is a particular kind of collapse Jung saw again and again in patients who were, by every external measure, successful. They arrived in his office not because they had failed at life, but because they had won it, and discovered, standing at the summit, that the view was empty. He described a pattern so consistent, he built an entire theory of psychological development around it. Somewhere near midlife, the strategies that built the first half of a person's identity simply stop producing meaning. The ambition that once felt like fuel starts to feel like a treadmill. The achievements that once proved something now prove nothing at all. Jung did not consider this a malfunction. He considered it an appointment, one that had been on the calendar since childhood, arriving exactly when it was supposed to. The tragedy, he wrote, is how many people respond to this appointment by doing more of what already isn't working. A new marriage, built on the same unresolved patterns as the old one. A new job title, chasing the same approval that never satisfied at the last title. A louder, more expensive persona, constructed to drown out a question that refuses to stay quiet. The question, in its simplest form, is this: who are you when the performance stops? Jung watched this question destroy people who refused to answer it, and transform people brave enough to sit with it. He watched a decorated general, hollowed out by the wars he had won, discover more peace in a garden he tended alone than he had ever found on a battlefield of victories. He watched patients who had spent decades terrified of being ordinary discover, on the other side of that terror, something closer to actual joy than any accomplishment had ever produced. Not because they stopped caring, because they stopped needing the outcome in order to feel whole. This, Jung believed, was the deepest reversal of all, the one modern ambition culture still refuses to accept, a century later. Desperation is not a symptom of wanting something too much. It is a symptom of believing you are incomplete without it. And the moment that belief loosens its grip, not through more effort, but through the opposite, everything the person was chasing tends to stop running away from them. Jung died in 1961, in the same lakeside house near Zurich, where much of his private war had unfolded decades earlier. By then, the terrified young doctor who once feared he was losing his mind to visions of blood and drowning cities had become one of the most influential thinkers of the century. His ideas, quietly seeding fields he never lived to see: modern therapy, addiction recovery, leadership psychology, even the design of the very self-improvement culture that, ironically, still tends to preach the opposite of what he discovered. Push harder, never stop, optimize everything, control the outcome. Jung spent 60 years and nearly lost his sanity once, arriving at a very different answer. The lake stills itself the moment you stop disturbing it. The shadow stops controlling you the moment you finally look at it directly. The mask stops being necessary the moment you remember it was never the whole face. And the thing you have spent your whole life chasing has a strange, ancient habit of finally arriving the moment you stop demanding that it save you. None of this means stop acting. Jung was not preaching passivity. He practiced medicine for 6 decades, wrote volumes of dense psychological theory, and worked obsessively until his final years. It means something more precise and considerably harder. Act from wholeness instead of from wound. Move because you have chosen to, not because a hidden fear is dragging you by the collar. Jung once wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. He spent his life proving there is another option. Not conquest, not control. Just the quiet, unglamorous, lifelong work of finally turning around to face the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime running from, and discovering, at last, that they were never actually chasing you to destroy you. They were only ever trying to come home.